Okay, y'all, so let's discuss voting rights because apparently our government has lost its mind. So I'm on my Katie Porter and I just want to bring this up to you guys. So when the 15th Amendment was enacted, it says that all have a right to vote except for women because uterus. Now, and as we know, when it comes to Newton's law, for every action, there is a reaction. For every positive impact black people have, there is a racist in the back trying to destroy it. So what became of the 15th Amendment and black people after it passed? Let's look at 4 major points post-Reconstruction, which is when the 15th Amendment happened. Let's look at what happened to get to this point. Andrew Johnson enacted black codes that targeted free black people. So there used to be slave codes and now there's black codes. And so this made it so hard for black people to be free and exist and also vote. And some of the Southern white Democrats ended up taking it an extra step by becoming a part of the KKK. And so they enacted the Colfax Massacre, right? Get this. Over 500 men showed up to a courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana. They surrounded this courthouse full of black people, told them to come out unarmed. The black people came out thinking they would surrender and nothing would happen. They murdered these people. Why? Because white fear is very dangerous. Southern whites feared that with the growing black population and the fact that black people had a right to vote was over correcting racism. And they couldn't have that because they were like, well, why are all these black political leaders in charge, right? Like, why? That's not how this is supposed to work. So they burned it down. And it didn't just stop there. The Compromise of 1877 happened because of a filibuster, kind of like what we just had this week. So Southern Democrats were up there debating and basically using corruption to get their laws passed to basically terrorize black people freely without any type of government pushback, right? The filibuster worked so well that they were able to compromise the presidency. So get this. White supremacists were so filled with rage when it came to black liberation that they gave up their chance at the presidency with Tilden. They exchanged the presidency in order for the troops to leave the South so that they can terrorize black people, free black people in the South without any recourse, because that's why the troops were there. They were actually protecting black people from white violence. The filibuster allowed this to happen. So now that Southern Democrats got what they wanted, they ended up getting more control in Congress and they got even more violent. Because what else? So I need to correct myself. The Colfax Massacre was 150 white men. It was the Wilmington Massacre, which I'm going to cover next, that was performed by 500 domestic terrorists. And just keep in mind, this is all because black people got the right to vote. Please keep this in mind. So 500 white men decided to show up to the city of Wilmington, North Carolina. And their goal was to push out all of the black Republicans, right? Well, they actually succeeded. So they ended up having the prominent black Republicans leave the city of Wilmington and they took it over. 14 people were murdered that day. 14 black people were murdered that day. And because of this, they were able to implement the grandfather clause. Now, let's think about this. This country previously, before this, made it illegal for black people to read and write. They made it illegal for black people to be free. They made it illegal for black people to own property. They made it illegal for black people to be considered as citizens. The grandfather clause said, if you could not pass a literacy test, regardless if your grandfather or your father was able to vote during the Reconstruction period, if you couldn't read, you couldn't vote. They took it a step further. Now remember, black people were working for free. The majority of black people in this country were forced to work for free. They implemented poll taxes, which said you have to pay a tax, a fee, in order to vote. Now this went on for several years. And remember I said that for every action, there's a reaction. So we leave the era of the Wilmington Massacre and we go on to years of voter suppression. In comes the Civil Rights era. in the 1960s when the Voting Rights Act was put in place. And of course, this did not stop white supremacists from trying to prevent black people from voting. We can get into the 80s where many black people were arrested. And you know what happens when you go to jail? A lot of people are not able to keep their voting rights. So that was a form of suppression. In 2006, a 25-year Voting Rights Act extension was put in place to protect black people's right to vote up until 2031. John Lewis knew this, and so he started writing up his version of the extension of the Voting Rights Act in 2019. And then we started seeing voter suppression throughout the last election in 2020. And recently we started seeing states, especially states like Texas, Ohio, Florida, implementing voter suppression tactics. Like, you can't even give people water who's standing in line to vote. All right, so let's get to this week in America. Yesterday, the Senate decided that they were going to vote in opposition of discussing H.R. 1, not H.R. 1, discussing it. They had a vote about a vote, and they shot it down using the filibuster. Now, let's tie it into the Compromise of 1877. This is why people say that it's racist. Remember, to get to the Compromise of 1877, they used the filibuster to delay progress and were basically corrupt. The same thing is happening in 2021. They used the filibuster to delay progress and push corruption so that black people could not have the right to vote. The same thing happened in 1877. So it's important to know that if you don't know history, you are doomed to repeat it. And that is exactly what is happening. Yesterday, the Senate decided that we don't even want to talk about the fact that black people need their rights to vote. We don't want to talk about the fight that they've had to overcome to get the rights to vote. Like, we've literally been voting somewhat without pushback since the 1960s. We haven't even had a full 100 years yet. Now let's go to some resources. The Black History 365 book allows you to highlight certain areas and take notes on the information that you're studying. Here's where I decided to look into the 15th Amendment. And here's a video that goes along with that information to further explain it to you. Now, remember, we talked about the black codes that were implemented by Andrew Johnson. You can go to blackpast.org and you can look at some of these black codes that were implemented to suppress and oppress black free people at this time. So in the state of Mississippi, a freed man who was unemployed longer than 2 weeks was supposed to pay a fine. And if he could not pay a fine, he would be put into jail for unpaid labor. That's where that 13th Amendment little caveat after the but comes in. So just imagine you're going to jail because you can't afford to stay out of jail and you can't get a job. It's a setup. The Black History 365 book also talks about the Colfax Massacre. You can go to the QR code, which is a link in the actual digital book, and it takes you to the breakdown from the Smithsonian Magazine. You can also check it out here at blackpast.org. Remember this book, The American Journey, that I told you guys about? The Compromise of 1877 doesn't go into much detail because of how violent it was towards African Americans. They don't really give you a full breakdown of it. However, the Black History 365 book does break it down, and it talks about how the filibuster obstructed justice for black people to get their rights to vote. Now, as I talked about, the Wilmington Massacre, which led to the removal of many black political leaders. This can be found on blackpast.org. It can be found in the Black History 365 textbook, which also references blackpast.org. And there are other additional tools to help you understand how vital lynching was when it came to voter suppression as well. In the American Journey book, there is no Wilmington Massacre because that was done on purpose. This section also does talk about the grandfather clause, and the American Journey book breaks down poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Blackpast.org also talks about the different cases that were involving the grandfather clause and the different clauses in different states. Now, American Journey gives 2 chapters to the Civil Rights era, and it literally starts with segregation and ends with the assassination of Dr. King. Black History 365 gives an entire unit to the Civil Rights era with 4 chapters, starting with the immediate impact of post-Reconstruction era and ending with the highlights of Black women when it came to Black liberation during the Civil Rights era, including Fannie Lou Hamer, a woman after my own heart. Now, of course, American Journey was printed in 2007, so it's not going to have the impact of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. However, you can go to history.house.gov and it talks about the constitutional amendments for Black Americans in Congress. Civil rights, I'm sorry. And at the very bottom, it talks about the Voting Rights Act of 2006. If you go to congress.gov, you'll be able to see the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And while still there, you can look at the For the People Act of 2021, which is HR 1. The reason why I decided to talk about this is because our voting rights are really at stake right now. And the GOP is pretending like this isn't rooted in racism. They're pretending like this isn't historically been done. They're pretending like what they're doing is not wrong. This is important for us to know accurate history. This isn't even critical race theory as it's being taught in the graduate level. This is basic American history at the pre-K to 12th grade level. And at some point, this country is going to have to reconcile with the consistent torment that they put on Black people and then lie in our faces about what they're actually doing. So abolish the racist filibuster and vote out these GOP white nationalists. That's all I got.